The chipped formica of the counter felt cold under my forearm. I'd pictured a little more neon. The ad online had shown this place buzzing, kids screaming, a kaleidoscope of light. What I walked into smelled like stale pizza and dust motes, and the only light came from the flickering screens of maybe 3 machines. It wasn't exactly a lie, the ad, just a selective truth. I needed the money, though, badly. $62,000, give or take, is what Sarah's medical bills were at last I checked. It's a number that sits behind my eyes when I try to sleep. So, buzzing or bleak, it didn't really matter. The arcade, Pixel Paradise, was smaller than I'd thought. One long room, mostly a checkerboard of worn carpet, lined with rows of games. Racing, fighting, those claw machines that always cheated you. A smaller room branched off to the left, dark and mostly filled with air hockey tables. A counter like the one I was leaning on ran almost the length of the main room, with a couple of plastic stools behind it. Behind that, a doorway led to what I assumed was a break room or office. The air was thick, stale. Not unpleasant, just heavy. Like the building itself was exhaling. The hum of the machines was the loudest thing, a constant electrical thrum, and underneath that, a kind of low, rhythmic clicking sound. I couldn't place it. Bev, the woman who handed over the keys, hadn't said much. Here, she'd said, shoving a ring of plastic into my hand. Code is 2319. Bathrooms around back. Don't let anyone loiter. She hadn't offered a smile, or a good luck, or even made eye contact. Just a quick, almost dismissive transfer of responsibility. She was already halfway out the door before I could ask about the cash box, or the security system, or anything. I figured she was just tired. It was almost 4 in the morning after all. I wandered around trying to get my bearings. The place hadn't been cleaned properly in days, maybe weeks. There were crumpled napkins under the skee-ball machines, a sticky residue on the joystick of Space Invaders. I found the break room, a cramped space with a mismatched table and 2 chairs, and on the wall, a whiteboard, covered in writing. That's where I saw the rules. 1. Never backdate a log entry. If you missed a recording window, leave it blank and note the gap. Do not fill it in retroactively, even with accurate information. A log? What log? 2. The prize redemption counter must be reset at 3:17 a.m. regardless of conditions. What kind of condition would prevent resetting a prize counter? It seemed unnecessarily specific. 3. Do not leave your personal bag, coat, or belongings unattended anywhere on the premises. Keep them with you or locked in your designated locker. Okay, that was reasonable, standard. A little paranoid maybe, but reasonable. 4. Do not enter the supply closet for any reason. The supply closet? That sounded odd. Why not? Did it have a wasp nest? Toxic chemicals? 5. Never stand in any doorway on the premises. Pass through completely or stay on one side. A person standing in a doorway belongs to neither space. Now that was just weird. I pictured myself awkwardly frozen mid-stride, trying to interpret that one. Probably some old employee's superstition. 6. Do not laugh out loud when alone anywhere on the premises. Smiling is fine. Laughter alone in an empty space is an invitation. An invitation to what? I snorted, a little laugh escaping me despite myself. See? No problem. Probably just a joke from a bored night attendant. 7. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. Okay? Now they were just messing with people. This place already echoed. 8. Close all blinds and curtains before 11 o'clock p.m. Do not look outside after dark. That felt disproportionate. It was a small arcade, not a fortress. I glanced at the dusty blinds covering the large front windows. 9. Do not stop moving in the hallway leading to the restrooms. If you need to review something, step into a room first. The hallway to the restrooms. It was barely 10 feet long. I could see it from where I stood. The thought of deliberately keeping myself in motion down that short stretch of corridor seemed ridiculous. Probably just a way to make sure the attendant walked the perimeter regularly. I read the rules again, then again. They were unsettling in their specificity. But people make up rules all the time, especially in odd jobs like this. It was just a way to pass the time, to feel like they were in control of something. I chuckled to myself, picturing the previous attendant meticulously resetting the prize counter at 3:17 a.m., no matter what was happening. I stowed my bag under the counter, then immediately remembered rule number 3. I pulled it back out and set it at my feet, feeling a little foolish. It was a worn canvas bag, nothing valuable inside. Just my notebook, a thermos of coffee, and a couple of granola bars. Still, rules were rules, right? I glanced at the clock. 12:08 a.m. My shift had officially begun. The rhythmic clicking sound, the one I hadn't been able to place, seemed louder now. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the chipped formica and the lingering smell of stale pizza. I started going through the ticket roll, counting down the remaining stubs. It was a pointless exercise, really. No one used tickets anymore. Everything was card-based now, even here at Pixel Paradise. But Bev had said, and I quote, "Mr. Abernathy likes to see the rolls accounted for." Mr. Abernathy, the owner, had never once shown his face during my brief training. The whole place felt like it ran on the inertia of past expectations. I smoothed out each stub as I counted, the thin paper brittle and smelling faintly of something sweet, like old bubblegum. The arcade was quiet. Even the air conditioning seemed to be taking a breather, leaving a layer of warmth clinging to the sticky carpet. It was around 2:30 a.m. Usually there'd be a couple of stragglers nursing their last few tokens, teenagers looking for a place to kill time, maybe someone trying their luck at the claw machine tonight. Nothing, just the hum of the machines and that damned clicking. It hadn't stopped since I clocked in. I'd convinced myself it was a faulty flipper on Space Invaders stuck in a loop. I'd walked over to it twice, listening, but couldn't pinpoint the source. I was on stub number 72 when the kid showed up. A small one, maybe 8 or 9, wearing a bright blue hoodie and clutching a handful of dollar bills. He beelined for the racing games, bypassing everything else. He was good too, really good. I watched him rack up points on Speed Racer, his small hands working the wheel with surprising precision. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at me, a quick, shy look. I offered a small wave, and he ducked his head back down, concentrating on the track. Then, around 3:15, everything went sideways. A group of 3 teenagers burst through the front doors, laughing and shouting. They started running around, slapping the machines, jostling each other. One of them nearly knocked over the Dance Dance Revolution platform. I immediately went on alert, my librarian instincts kicking in, a quiet space disrupted. I told them to keep it down, politely at first, then a little more firmly when they ignored me. They just laughed harder, and one of them started trying to pry open the prize counter. That's when I had to go over, and things got tense. A lot of raised voices, a threat of calling the police, and finally them grudgingly leaving. It took a good 10 minutes to calm down, to check the prize counter hadn't been damaged, and to generally just regain some sense of order. When I finally sat back down at the counter, I realized I'd completely lost track of time. The logbook was open in front of me. My job was to mark down every half hour, just a quick all quiet or a brief description of anything unusual. I looked at the last entry. 1:30 a.m. A whole hour had passed. I stared at the blank space for 2 a.m., then 2:30 a.m. I could fill it in. Minor disturbance, 3 teenagers, resolved. It would be accurate enough. No one would know the difference. But then I remembered the rules. That fragment, hazy now about not backdating entries. Something about records being like maps and putting yourself in the wrong place. It felt overblown. This wasn't some official security log. It was a silly arcade, and I'd just missed a couple of tick marks. I could easily just write in what happened. It was honest, it was accurate, and it would save me from looking negligent. I hesitated for maybe 30 seconds, pen hovering over the page. Then I remembered the specificity of the rules. It wasn't about negligence. It was about the act of changing the record. That felt different. I left the spaces blank, a clean, empty gap in the timeline. Next to the 2:30 a.m. entry, I wrote, "Gap in recording disturbance with patrons. See 3:15 a.m. entry." It felt ridiculous. I was treating a $10 an hour job like it was a top-secret operation. The clicking sound, which had faded into the background during the commotion, seemed louder again now. I glanced at Space Invaders. The flippers weren't moving. The sound wasn't coming from there. I shivered, despite the warmth in the arcade. I pushed the logbook aside and started counting the ticket roll again. I was now acutely aware of the empty spaces between the numbered stubs, and I had a growing suspicion that something, somewhere, was keeping track of those gaps too. I spent the next hour wiping down the game cabinets. It wasn't in the job description. Exactly. Bev hadn't mentioned it. But the plastic on these things was coated in a film of something. Sticky, vaguely sweet, like 1,000 spilled sodas had evaporated and left their residue behind. I started with the fighting games, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct. The joysticks were especially bad, all gummy and worn. I used a spray cleaner and a rag, going over each button, each surface. It was mindless work, but it kept my hands busy, and honestly, it was kind of satisfying. The arcade was still empty. 4:45 a.m. The quiet was almost oppressive. I could hear the low thrum of the city outside, a distant rumble. But in here it was just the hum of electricity and the occasional click of the air conditioning. I found myself thinking about Ren, my daughter. She'd have a math test today. I'd promised to help her study last night, but I'd been too tired. Exhausted, really. The medical bills just hung over everything, a constant weight. Every shift felt like a small battle against them. I moved on to the racing games, then the shooting games, working my way around the perimeter of the arcade. That's when I noticed it. Tucked away in the back corner, almost hidden by the Time Crisis cabinet, was a large metal box. It was painted a dull gray industrial-looking and covered in warning labels. I hadn't seen it before. I'd walked the perimeter of the arcade a dozen times in the last few days, and I was sure I would have noticed something that big. I cautiously approached it. The labels were faded, but I could make out a few words. High voltage, emergency shutoff, do not tamper. There was a small digital clock mounted on the front of the box, and below that, a single red button. I ran my hand over the cool metal, trying to figure out what it did. It didn't seem to be connected to any specific game, just sitting there. Then I saw the small, laminated card taped to the side of the box. It was handwritten, in the same messy scrawl as the rules in the break room. I read it slowly, carefully. Generator reset, 5 a.m. sharp, no exceptions. So it was a generator. A backup generator, maybe? And it needed to be reset every night. At 5 a.m., I glanced at the clock on my phone. 4:53 a.m. I almost dismissed it. Probably just some routine maintenance thing. A way to keep the power stable, but the no exceptions part stuck with me. It felt heavy, like it wasn't just about keeping the lights on. I remembered the rules, the fragmented feeling of them, the unsettling precision. Something about records and timelines and not interfering with things. I couldn't quite bring the words to mind, but the feeling was there, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I told myself it was just a generator, a simple mechanical task. I was overthinking it. I was letting the weirdness of this place get to me. I was tired, stressed about money, and seeing patterns where there weren't any. But the clock was ticking, and the card specifically said no exceptions. At exactly 5 o'clock, I pressed the red button. It clicked with a solid, metallic sound. The digital clock on the box flickered, then reset to 0. Nothing else happened. No lights flickered, no alarms blared, no machine sputtered and died. Everything continued to hum along as before. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. See, just a generator, nothing to worry about. Then the sound started. It wasn't the clicking I'd been hearing earlier. This was different. A low, resonant hum, vibrating through the floor. It seemed to be coming from everywhere, and with the hum came a change in the air. It grew colder, heavier, almost viscous. I could feel it on my skin, like a static charge. I looked around the arcade, searching for the source of the sound. The machines were still running, the lights were still on, but something had shifted. The colors seemed duller, the shadows deeper, and there was a distortion in the air, a shimmering heat haze, particularly around the Space Invaders machine. I stared at Space Invaders. The screen was still displaying the game, but the pixels seemed wrong, jagged, unstable, like they were struggling to hold their shape. And behind the screen, in the darkness of the cabinet, I thought I saw something move, a flicker of shadow, a brief distortion of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my eyes, fatigue, the weird atmosphere. I needed to get out of here, get some coffee, try to clear my head. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the Space Invaders machine, and the humming continued to grow louder, resonating in my chest. The distortion in the air intensified, coalescing into a shape, a vague outline, shifting and swirling in the darkness. It wasn't a defined form, not an image I could easily grasp, but it felt present. I finally tore my gaze away from the machine and looked back at the gray box. The clock read 5 a.m., still zeroed out. I had done everything right, I had followed the instructions, and yet, something was very, very wrong. I backed away from the box slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the night was far from over. I felt a tightness in my jaw, a dull ache that hadn't been there before. I ran my tongue over my teeth. They felt too long. I spent the next hour restocking the prize counter. Mostly cheap plastic toys, sticky hands, and those little bouncy balls that leave a film on everything they touch. It was mind-numbing work, but it kept my hands busy and my head mostly empty. Bev hadn't even bothered to sort the inventory properly. She just dumped everything into boxes and left it for me. I kept expecting her to show up, to offer some explanation for the rules, or at least a proper handover. Nothing. The arcade was quiet, thankfully. Just the hum of the machines and the occasional click-clack of someone playing Pinball FX. A kid, maybe 8 or 9, was glued to Dance Dance Revolution, flailing his arms and legs with impressive, if chaotic, energy. It was normal, almost. I kept glancing at the Space Invaders machine, half expecting to see that distortion again, but it just sat there, blinking innocently. I'd started to wonder if I'd imagined it all, if the generator reset had just rattled me. I was sorting through a box of plastic rings, the kind you win for 10 tickets, when my phone buzzed. It was Winnie, my wife. She was just checking in, making sure I was okay. I quickly texted back, telling her everything was fine, just a slow night. I wanted to tell her about the weirdness, about the feeling of something being off. But I didn't want to worry her. She'd just gotten over pneumonia, and the stress was the last thing she needed. Then I remembered the library book. I'd promised to pick up a specific edition of Moby Dick for Mrs. Abernathy, a regular patron who was working on a comparative literature project. It was a first edition, apparently, and she'd asked me to check a rare book dealer on the way to work. I'd completely forgotten about it, and the dealer closed at 6. I glanced at my bag, slung over the back of a chair in the break room. My wallet, phone, keys, the book request slip with the dealer's address. Everything was in there. I needed to make a quick call, confirm they still had the book. But the rules, that snippet of a rule I couldn't quite piece together. Something about belongings, not leaving them unattended. I dismissed it. It was just a silly rule, probably to prevent theft. This wasn't some haunted house. It was an arcade. I needed to make a phone call. It would take 2 minutes tops. But the image of that list in the break room flashed in my mind. The stark black text on the faded yellow paper. The unnerving precision of it all. I told myself I was being ridiculous, overreacting, paranoid. It was a bag. In a locked room, what could possibly go wrong? But the thought wouldn't leave me. The feeling of being watched intensified. I hesitated, then made a decision. I'd leave the bag, just for a few minutes. I needed to handle this. I could lock the break room door. That would be enough. I locked the break room door, double-checking the latch to make sure it was secure. Then I walked back to the counter and retrieved my phone. The dealer still had the book. They were holding it for me until closing. Relief washed over me. I quickly made arrangements to pick it up tomorrow. It took less than 5 minutes. When I returned to the break room, the door unlocked easily with my key. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The chair was still there, the bag still slung over the back. I walked over and reached for it, a small smile playing on my lips. See? Nothing happened. I was being silly. But as I lifted the bag, I noticed something was different. Everything was still there. Wallet, phone, keys. But the book request slip was gone. It wasn't crumpled on the floor. It wasn't tucked inside my wallet. It had simply vanished. I emptied the entire bag, searching frantically. Nothing. Just the usual clutter. I stared at the empty space where the slip had been. A cold knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't the slip itself that bothered me. It was the fact that something had taken it. Something had been in here, something that knew what I was looking for, and it had taken it without disturbing anything else. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still rummaging through the bag, the humming from the machines suddenly louder, more insistent. The kid on Dance Dance Revolution had stopped playing and was staring at me. I quickly looked away. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just knew that I had broken a rule, and something had noticed, and I hadn't gotten the book. Mrs. Abernathy was going to be very disappointed. I was restocking the prize counter, rows and rows of plastic junk, stuffed animals with vacant eyes, cheap bouncy balls, plastic rings that turned your finger green. It was tedious, but someone had to do it. Bev usually handled it on weekends, but Bev called out sick with the flu, so it fell to me. I was meticulously arranging the glow sticks, separating the blue from the green, when I noticed the flickering again. Not the lights this time. The little holographic projector above the Space Invaders machine. It was supposed to cycle through different alien designs, but it was stuck on a single distorted image, a kind of blur, like a photograph taken underwater. I tapped the side of the machine, hoping it was just a loose connection. It didn't change. I made a mental note to tell Vito about it in the morning. He was the tech guy. He'd probably just roll his eyes and say I was imagining things. The whole arcade felt quieter than usual. It was nearly 2. Usually, even this late, you had a few stragglers. A couple of teenagers trying to beat high scores, someone nursing a soda, zoning out in Street Fighter. But tonight, just the hum of the machines and the faint throb of bass from the music system. It wasn't unsettling, exactly. Just empty. I finished with the glow sticks and moved on to the rubber ducks. Yellow, pink, and a disconcerting number of lime green ones. I glanced at the logbook. Still hadn't gotten around to filling in the generator reset time from this morning. I'd meant to do it during my break, but the missing slip had thrown me off. I reminded myself I needed to do it. Keeping accurate records was important. That whole backdating incident with the power outage last week had rattled Mr. Henderson. He'd been surprisingly stern, and I didn't want to deal with that again. It wasn't worth the hassle. I was stacking the ducks when I noticed it. The door. At the back of the arcade, tucked between the pinball machines and the skee-ball lanes, the one I'd never seen open. It was just a plain metal door, painted the same drab gray as the walls. No signage, no handle, just a thin, almost invisible seam where the door met the frame. I'd always assumed it led to some kind of storage closet, maybe a utility room. I found myself walking towards it, not intentionally, not because I was curious. It was more like a pull, a subtle, almost imperceptible tug. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the door. The air felt colder here, not drastically, just a slight chill. I could feel the hairs on my arms rise. I told myself it was just a draft. The old building wasn't exactly airtight. And then I remembered. A phrase, fragmented and indistinct, surfacing from the depths of my memory. Something from that list. Something about a place you didn't go, a place that wasn't for anyone. Do not enter that area. That was it, wasn't it? Or was it a void? It was blurry, indistinct, but the feeling was clear. A visceral, instinctive warning. It didn't make any sense. Why would there be a door leading to what? Some kind of off-limits area? The arcade was already pretty dilapidated. What could be back there that they needed to keep hidden? Probably just old maintenance equipment, boxes of broken parts, something perfectly mundane. I was letting my imagination run wild. It was late, I was tired, and I'd already had one weird thing happen with the slip. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't mundane, that there was something fundamentally wrong about that door. Something beyond broken parts and dusty boxes. I remembered the stories Ren used to tell, about the previous owners, about the arcade's history. Old rumors about accidents, about things disappearing. I'd always dismissed them as gossip. But now, I stepped back, slowly. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had done the right thing. I went back to the prize counter and started rearranging the plastic dinosaurs. The flickering above Space Invaders had stopped. The holographic projector was cycling through the alien designs again. each one crisp and clear. It felt different now, brighter, more insistent. I kept stacking the dinosaurs, one plastic reptile after another. The silence of the arcade pressed in around me, heavier than before. I had a sudden, overwhelming need to get through this shift, to get home, to be with Sarah. I noticed my hands were damp, not sweaty exactly, just moist, like I'd been holding something cold. I wiped them on my jeans, then started cataloging the remaining prizes. I had a feeling I wouldn't be sleeping much tonight, and I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that the missing request slip wasn't the last thing that was going to be different. Something had shifted, something had been avoided, and I had no idea what it was. I was restocking the claw machine, the big one with the plush aliens. It's always the aliens. Kids go crazy for those stupid things. I was trying to arrange them so the good ones, the ones with the sparkly eyes, were visible, hoping it would encourage more attempts. It didn't really matter, of course. The machine was rigged. Not aggressively, but enough to discourage consistent wins. The owner, Bev, said it was about managing expectations. I suspected it was about maximizing profit. The plastic smell of the aliens was intense. It clung to my fingers, even after I'd handled a dozen of them. I'd started to notice smells more vividly since I took this job. Maybe it was the quiet, with nothing but the hum of the machines and the occasional beep. Your other senses just crank up to compensate. Or maybe it was the stress. Everything felt sharper when you were constantly worrying about bills. Bev had left a note taped to the register, just a quick reminder to check the coin slots in the racing games. People still tried to jam things in there, despite the signs. Bent spoons, bottle caps, even once a half-eaten granola bar. You'd think people would have better things to do with their time. I finished with the aliens and started towards the back, passing the doorway to the break room. Glenn was in there fiddling with the ancient microwave. He was on the early shift, usually a college kid studying something to do with computer science. I think he barely spoke, just nodded when you said hello. "Hey, Glenn," I said as I walked by. He mumbled something in response, not looking up. I kept going, heading towards the racing games. I had a small screwdriver in my pocket for prying out jammed objects. It was a useless tool, really. Usually I just had to call Bev. She had a proper set and a disturbingly thorough knowledge of what people tried to shove into arcade machines. As I passed the break room doorway, Glenn started talking again. Something about a bug in a program. I stopped. Not intentionally, it was just that he sounded agitated. He rarely raised his voice. I figured he was having a rough night. I leaned slightly into the doorway, wanting to offer some kind of encouragement, just to hang in there or something. The air changed. Immediately it felt thicker. Colder, but not like a draft, more like a weight pressing against my skin. My nostrils flared, trying to identify it. It wasn't a smell exactly, more like the absence of smell, like all the air had been scrubbed clean of any scent. My teeth ached, a dull throbbing pressure in my jaw. I told myself it was the microwave. Maybe it was overheating. Or Glenn was microwaving something particularly pungent. I was being ridiculous. I was letting my nerves get to me. This job was getting to me. I needed to focus. I needed to get these coin slots checked, and then I could actually sit down and work on my novel for a little while. But my feet hadn't moved. I was still half in, half out of the doorway. And the pressure was building. My vision felt narrowed, like I was looking through a tunnel. I tried to take a step forward, into the break room, to actually say something to Glenn. But my leg felt heavy, like it was stuck in concrete. That's when I remembered. A flash of the list, the pale yellow paper, the typed rules. Something about doorways, never in a doorway, neither space. It wasn't a complete thought, just fragments, but the feeling was overwhelming, a wave of nausea, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I jerked back, stumbling slightly. I took a full step away from the doorway, planting both feet firmly on the worn arcade carpet. The pressure immediately lessened. The ache in my teeth subsided. The air returned to normal. The smell of plastic aliens, thankfully, was back. Glenn hadn't noticed anything. He was still hunched over the microwave, muttering about code. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was just a coincidence. a weird fluctuation in the building's temperature, a momentary lapse in my own judgment. I was letting the strangeness of this place get to me. I checked the racing games, found a crumpled dollar bill jammed in the coin slot of Outrun. Pried it out with the screwdriver. It was damp and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. As I was walking back towards the register, I glanced at the break room doorway. It looked normal, just an opening in the wall. But something had changed. I noticed a small circular stain on the floor, just inside the doorway. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't a liquid stain, not exactly. It looked more like discoloration, a subtle fading of the carpet's pattern. Like something had been sitting there, absorbing the color. It was small, maybe 6 inches across, but it was undeniably wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd interrupted something. I finished checking the coin slots and then went back to the prize counter. I didn't rearrange any more dinosaurs. Instead, I started making a detailed inventory of the remaining plush toys, counting them, categorizing them, writing everything down in my notebook. Not for Bev, for myself. I needed to document things. I needed to keep track of what was happening. I needed to be prepared. I kept glancing at the break room doorway. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the stain hadn't been there before, and that it was getting larger. I was counting the plush prizes again. Specifically, the miniature racing cars. There were 17. 17 little felt cars with embroidered flames and slightly lopsided wheels. It felt important to be precise, to have a record. Bev wouldn't care, of course. She just wanted the arcade to be clean and the money to be counted, but I needed to know. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a low, constant drone. It was almost 2:30. The graveyard shift was living up to its name. No customers for hours, just me and the ghosts of quarters past. I was trying to ignore the discoloration spreading near the break room. It was subtle, but definitely growing, like a slow stain leaching into the carpet. I'd measured it with a ruler during my last patrol. Marked the edges with a tiny piece of tape. It had expanded by an inch since then. I checked my phone, nothing. No messages from Ren. She was working a double at the diner. I scrolled through Reddit looking for some distraction, found a thread about terrible first dates. One post in particular made me chuckle. This guy's date had spent the entire evening talking about her ex-boyfriend's taxidermied squirrel. Apparently, it was a very emotional squirrel. I let out a laugh, a short, genuine burst of amusement. It echoed oddly in the empty arcade. A little too loud, a little too free. I immediately regretted it. I cut it off mid-chuckle, feeling a flush creep up my neck. What was I doing, laughing? In a place like this, it felt wrong. It was just a joke. A stupid story about a taxidermied squirrel. I was being ridiculous, overreacting. This job was making me paranoid. I was seeing things, hearing things. I needed to calm down. I needed to focus on the plush cars. 17. Definitely 17. But then the lights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a brief, almost imperceptible dip. The fluorescent tubes at the far end of the arcade, near the skee-ball machines, dimmed for a fraction of a second. And I remembered something, another fragment of the list. Do not laugh alone, an invitation. Something about silence, about not drawing attention. It wasn't clear. It was like trying to grasp smoke. I glanced around, heart rate picking up. The arcade was still empty, still silent, except for the hum of the machines. I told myself it was the power grid, old wiring. The building was practically ancient. It had to be a coincidence, a simple electrical fluctuation. It wasn't related to the laughing. It wasn't related to the list. It wasn't related to anything except old infrastructure. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease. I needed to get back to the inventory. I needed to be methodical. I needed to be normal. I started counting the miniature airplanes. There were 12. But the discoloration, I couldn't stop thinking about the discoloration. And now this, the flickering lights, the rule. I tried to remember the exact wording, something about inviting something in. The thought made my scalp tingle. I got up from the prize counter, needing to move, to walk, to do something, anything. I decided to check the restrooms. They hadn't been used in hours. I walked down the long corridor, the worn carpet muffling my footsteps. The air felt colder here somehow, staler. I unlocked the men's room and quickly scanned the space. Empty, clean. I checked the sink, the toilet, the stall. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I was turning to leave, I noticed a small, circular scuff mark on the linoleum floor, just inside the doorway. It was new. I hadn't seen it before. It was about the size of a quarter, a dark smudge against the pale floor. It didn't look like a stain. It looked like pressure, like something had been pressed into the floor. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a customer had scuffed their shoe. Maybe it was just a random mark. But the feeling of unease was overwhelming. The air felt thick, heavy. I felt a tightness in my chest. I quickly locked the restroom and hurried back towards the front of the arcade. I had to get away from that spot. I had to get back to the relative safety of the register. I needed to see Glenn, to talk to someone, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I glanced back over my shoulder. The corridor was dark and empty, but I could have sworn I saw the discoloration near the break room had grown again. I didn't bother with the women's room. I went straight back to the register, grabbing my notebook. I started sketching the scuff mark, trying to capture its shape, its texture, its location. A small, dark circle, a silent warning. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew, with growing dread, that it was connected to everything else. The list, the doorway, the flickering lights, the laugh. And I knew I had to be careful, more careful than ever before. I capped my pen and closed the notebook and stared at the growing darkness near the break room. I was restocking the prize claw machine, the small plush aliens, the ones with mismatched eyes. Kids loved those things. Or their parents did, at least. It felt like a victory for the parents more than the kids, a small, manageable defeat. 25 cents and a fleeting moment of triumph. I sorted through the box, smoothing the fur on each one, arranging them in a slightly more appealing configuration inside the glass. It was mindless. It was quiet. It was good. The arcade was still empty at 2:17 a.m., just the low hum of the machines, the occasional click and whir of gears. I'd already done 2 full loops of the floor, checking for anything out of place. Nothing. No new scuff marks, no spreading discoloration, no anything. I'd even peeked at the forbidden door, keeping my body well clear of the frame, just to reassure myself it hadn't somehow moved closer. It hadn't. I was starting to think I'd overreacted to everything. The list was just a weird prank someone had left behind. The discoloration was probably just grime. The scuff mark, well, people scuff things. It was a public place. I finished with the aliens and moved on to the racing games. The steering wheels needed wiping down, sticky fingerprints. I sprayed the cleaner onto a rag and started scrubbing, going over each wheel methodically. The smell of the cleaner, that artificial lemon scent, was strangely comforting. It smelled clean, normal. I was probably just tired. The double shifts were catching up with me, and the worry about the bills. They were always there, a dull ache in the back of my mind. I moved past the skee-ball lanes towards the back of the arcade where the older, more obscure games were clustered. The concrete floor back there was plain, uncarpeted. I hadn't thought much about it before. It just was. As I walked, my footsteps, normally absorbed by the carpet, sounded different, sharper. And then, almost immediately, they echoed. Not a booming echo like in a cavern. It was subtle, a faint, delayed repetition of each step. A ghost of a sound, but it was definitely there. I stopped walking. My first thought was the generator. Maybe it had thrown something off, messed with the acoustics somehow. That was it. It had to be. The generator was temperamental. Old, it was probably the source of everything weird that had been happening, everything. The flickering lights, the discoloration, the scuff mark, even the list. It was all just electrical interference, a faulty generator. I'd mention it to Glenn in the morning. He'd know what to do. But I knew that wasn't right. I'd been walking on that concrete for months. It had never echoed. Never. And the generator hadn't been acting up. I'd done the reset, everything by the book, and even if it had, it didn't explain the echo. It felt wrong. I remembered the list, a fragment of something about responding to sounds, or avoiding them. It was hazy, the wording imprecise. Something about attention, about not drawing attention. I couldn't recall the exact phrasing, but I remembered the underlying feeling, a warning, a sense that certain sounds were dangerous. The echo was a sound that hadn't been there before. I stood perfectly still, trying to listen. The echo persisted, mirroring my stillness. Each micro-adjustment of my weight, the slight creak of my jeans, resonated back to me. It wasn't fading, it wasn't diminishing. It was maintaining a perfect, unnerving replica of my movements. 30 seconds, that was the number. 30 seconds. Stand still for 30 seconds. I counted them out, slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3. My throat felt dry. My pulse was doing a strange little flutter in my temple. 30. I took a tentative step forward. The echo returned, immediate and precise. I stopped again. The echo continued. I tried another step. Same result. It didn't matter that I was standing still now. The echo was independent of my movement. It was just there, layered over the normal sounds of the arcade, a subtle but insistent distortion. I looked around, trying to see if I could identify the source. A loose panel? A hidden speaker? But there was nothing. Just the rows of silent machines, the dusty carpet, the blank concrete floor, and the echo. Then I saw it. Or rather the impression of it. A heat distortion, like looking at asphalt on a hot day. It wasn't visible head-on, but at the periphery of my vision, as I shifted my gaze, a shimmering outline materialized against the far wall. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but indistinct, blurry, as if seen through water. It pulsed slightly, in time with the echo. The shape wasn't moving towards me, it wasn't doing anything, it just was existing within the echo, occupying the space the sound had created. It didn't look like it could touch me, but it felt like it was watching, and it was then that I noticed the smell. Not the lemon cleaner, not the stale air of the arcade. Something else, something metallic, but not like metal, more like old pennies, and something else clinging to that smell, something sickly sweet, like overripe fruit. I backed away, slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on the shimmering outline. The echo followed me, unwavering. I didn't run. Running felt like the wrong thing to do. It felt like it would draw whatever that was closer. I reached the edge of the concrete, stepping back onto the carpet. The echo abruptly stopped. The shimmering outline vanished. The smell faded. I stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily. My skin felt cold and clammy. My mouth tasted like tin. I glanced back at the concrete floor. It looked normal, ordinary, but I knew it wasn't. I knew something had been there, something that shouldn't have been, and the fact that I'd followed the rule, done everything right, hadn't changed a thing. The arcade felt different now. It wasn't just old and dilapidated, it felt occupied. I rubbed my arms, a knot forming in my stomach. I quickly scribbled a single word in my notebook: resonance. Then I headed towards the break room, needing a glass of water, and maybe, just maybe, needing to check that door again. I needed to inventory the prize counter. Bev, the daytime attendant, was notoriously bad about keeping track of what was actually in stock. She'd order a shipment of those little plastic dinosaurs, then swear she'd already used them all, demanding another order a week later. It was a waste, and it fell to me to sort it out. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a quiet task, something to occupy my hands and my mind. The counter was a mess, naturally. Stuffed animals with missing eyes, plastic rings tangled in necklaces, those little bouncy balls that always smelled faintly of rubber and regret. I started sorting, making a list in my notebook. 12 plastic dinosaurs. Bev was off by, well, a lot. 8 glow-in-the-dark slinkies. 3 partially deflated basketballs. I tried to be methodical, categorizing everything, estimating quantities. It was almost relaxing. The windows behind the counter were big, stretching almost the entire length of the wall. They looked out onto the parking lot, and beyond that, the dark, empty fields surrounding the arcade. Usually they were covered with thick, dusty blinds, but someone, probably me, if I was being honest, had left a gap in the slats, a single horizontal slice of darkness. I adjusted the blinds, pulling them together until the gap was gone. I remembered reading something in that ridiculous manual, the one Glenn had practically shoved at me on my first night. A section about closing up, something about the windows, a vague impression of a time, before 10, close everything before 10. "Don't look outside after dark." The wording wasn't precise, and I hadn't paid much attention at the time. Just another arbitrary rule in a building full of them. I went back to the inventory, mentally subtracting the items I'd already counted. I was almost done. Just the keychains and the rubber ducks left. I glanced at the clock. 9:47. Plenty of time. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like something dragging against the glass. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the still-running arcade machines. I paused, pen hovering over the page. Probably just a branch scraping in the wind. This place was old. The trees were overgrown. It wasn't unusual. I kept working, trying to ignore the sound, but it came again. Louder this time. A definite scrape. And then a clicking, like fingernails tapping against the window pane. I told myself it was a raccoon. We had a few that hung around the dumpster. They were bold little creatures. They'd probably figured out how to climb onto the window ledges. It was logical. It was explainable. But the clicking continued, rhythmic, deliberate. And the scraping seemed to be moving, as if whatever was making the sound was walking along the glass. I glanced towards the window. My hand instinctively went to the blind cord. I hesitated. The manual. That vague rule about not looking. Close everything before 10. Don't look outside after dark. It was probably just a silly precaution. An overabundance of caution. But what if it wasn't? I told myself it was ridiculous. It was just a raccoon. I needed to finish the inventory. Bev would be furious if I didn't get it done. And beyond that, I was already behind on bills. If I lost this job, I didn't know what we'd do. My wife was still recovering. The medical bills were piling up. I had to be responsible. I took a deep breath and pulled the blind cord, shutting the window completely. The scraping stopped immediately. The clicking ceased. Silence. I leaned against the counter, my chest tight. That was it. I'd been silly to worry. It was just a raccoon, probably. I finished the inventory, scribbling down the final numbers. 27 rubber ducks, slightly faded yellow. But as I was gathering my things, I noticed something. A small circular stain on the glass, right where the scraping had been. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't water, it was a smudge, like something had been pressed against the window, something oily. I wiped at it with my sleeve. It wouldn't come off, it just smeared, leaving a greasy film. And then I noticed something else, a faint outline, a shape. Barely visible, but definitely there, a handprint. But it wasn't a human handprint. It was too long, too slender. And the fingers, they were too many. 6 fingers. I stared at the smudge, my mouth dry. I hadn't looked at the time. I checked my phone. 10:12. I was late. I should have closed the blinds when I first heard the sound. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and hurried towards the exit. I needed to get out of here. I needed a strong cup of coffee, and I needed to call a plumber. The drain in the bathroom was backing up again. As I walked past the front windows, I couldn't help but glance at them. They were covered, of course, but in the reflection of the glass I saw something flicker. A shadow. Just for a moment, a fleeting glimpse of something watching me. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. But I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't a raccoon. And I knew, with a growing dread, that the plumbing wasn't my biggest problem anymore. The drain could wait. I had a feeling tomorrow's inventory would be much more complicated. I spent the next hour doing inventory, mostly just walking the rows of machines, making sure everything was still plugged in, counting the tickets in the dispensers. It was mind-numbing, but better than thinking. Bev had left a note taped to the prize counter asking if I'd managed to fix the claw machine. I hadn't. I wasn't handy. I'd promised Ren I'd look into it, but I knew I wouldn't. Ren would be disappointed. I'd probably just tell her it was a complicated electrical issue, beyond my skill set. She'd believe me. She always did. The arcade was quiet, even for this time. The hum of the machines was almost soothing if you ignored the occasional glitch or stutter. I checked the change machines, added a few dollars to each. Felt like a pointless task, but it was something to do. I needed to seem busy, needed to feel like I was earning the money. $50,000 in medical bills doesn't pay itself, and even with my librarian gig, we were sinking fast. I reached the hallway that led to the bathrooms in the back office. The long, narrow stretch between the racing games and the fighting games. It always felt colder in that hallway, even with the heating on. Probably just the draft. It was an old building. The floor was a cheap, dark gray tile, worn smooth in places, chipped in others. I usually tried to walk quickly through there just to get it over with. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my wife, just checking in. She worried. I stopped walking to read it. It was a long one, detailing her appointment with the specialist, a new medication they were considering. I started typing a reply, thumbs fumbling on the screen. That's when I noticed it. Or rather, didn't notice it. The lights at the far end of the hallway, they were dimming. One by one, flickering, then going out completely. The last one extinguished with a soft click. For a moment, I just stood there, staring into the darkness. Probably just a faulty circuit. The wiring in this place was ancient. Old buildings did that. They creaked and groaned and had electrical problems. It was perfectly normal. I could go find a flashlight in the office or even just walk to the end of the hall and flip the light switch. It was probably just a loose connection. But then something felt wrong. Not a sound, not a smell, just a pressure, a shift in the air, a prickle on the back of my neck, and a sudden sharp recollection of something I'd read in that ridiculous employee handbook. Something about movement, about not stopping, a fragment, a warning. Don't pause, keep moving. I didn't think about it. I didn't analyze it. I didn't even finish typing my reply to my wife. I just started walking. Fast. I walked as quickly as I could, keeping my head down, focusing on the chipped tiles in front of me. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I didn't even breathe properly. Just walked and walked and walked until I reached the relative brightness of the back office. I leaned against the doorframe, gasping for air. My legs were trembling, but not from exertion. It was something else, something cold, something internal. I looked back down the hallway. It was still dark, completely dark. And I realized I hadn't even considered going to check the lights, hadn't even thought about grabbing a flashlight. I just moved. The rational part of my brain, the librarian part, was already trying to explain it away. A momentary lapse in the building's power grid, a coincidence, a side effect of not enough sleep. But the other part, the part that had felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, knew better. I checked my phone again. My wife had sent another text. "You okay?" You stopped mid-sentence. I typed back a quick, "All good," just a weird flicker. This place is ancient. I didn't mention the darkness. I didn't mention the feeling. I went back to the inventory list, trying to focus, but my hands were still shaking. Not visibly, but I could feel it, a subtle tremor in my fingers. It wasn't the cold, it wasn't exhaustion. And then I noticed something else. A new scuff mark on the tile, just outside the back office door. A long, dark smudge, like something had been dragged across the floor. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I had walked past this spot just an hour ago. I stared at the scuff mark. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It led directly into the darkness of the hallway, and it felt like a line that had been deliberately drawn, a line I had just crossed. I closed my notebook. I had no desire to write anything down, no urge to analyze or dissect what had just happened. I just wanted to finish my shift. I wanted to go home. I wanted to see my wife. But I knew with a growing sense of dread that the hallway was waiting. And I knew with chilling certainty that it wasn't finished with me yet. The walk to my car felt longer than usual. The neon glow of the arcade sign cast long, distorted shadows. They seemed to stretch and writhe with a life of their own. I kept expecting something to be there, just beyond the periphery of my vision. But there was nothing, just the empty parking lot and the humid night air. I unlocked the car, The click of the remote sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, careful to keep it within my sight. Old habits, I guess. The thought crossed my mind that it was all just stress. The bills, the worry about my wife, the isolation of the job. My brain was playing tricks on me, filling the quiet with imagined threats. It was a silly, exhausting habit, inventing monsters when the real ones were already circling. The drive home was uneventful. I focused on the radio, trying to lose myself in the music. But even the familiar melodies felt off. Static was underneath the lyrics, a dissonance I couldn't quite place. I pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat for a moment just breathing. My wife Sarah was already asleep when I got inside. She looked so small and fragile, her breathing shallow and even. Seeing her always tightened something in my chest. It wasn't relief. Exactly. More like a low-level ache. I changed into pajamas, careful not to wake her, and slipped into bed beside her. I didn't tell her about the scuff mark, or the darkness, or the feeling of being watched. I just held her, trying to absorb some of her peace. The next few shifts passed without incident, or at least without anything obviously incident-related. I still found myself checking the corners of the arcade, scanning the shadows. I still flinched at sudden noises, but the lights didn't flicker. No more handprints appeared, no more echoing footsteps. I started to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it had been a particularly vivid nightmare fueled by exhaustion and anxiety. I found myself resetting the generator at 5 o'clock in the morning, even on nights when I didn't need to. It felt right, like completing a necessary ritual. I couldn't explain it, but the thought of deviating from that schedule filled me with a vague sense of unease. I tried to get back to my writing, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I sat down at my desk, I found myself staring at the blank page, my mind filled with fragments of the arcade, the chipped Formica countertops, the flickering fluorescent lights, the endless rows of silent machines. I started sketching floor plans of the arcade in my notebook instead, meticulously mapping out every corner, every hallway, every doorway. Sarah's health improved steadily. The medical bills, however, remained. I picked up extra shifts at the library, volunteering for weekend events. It wasn't enough. The arcade job was a necessary evil. I quit a month ago, took a part-time position at a bookstore. The pay is worse, but the atmosphere is cleaner, lighter. I still dream about the arcade sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just fragments, sounds, shadows, the persistent feeling of being observed. I've noticed something new, though. Something I didn't realize I was doing until recently. Whenever I enter a new building, a new room, a new space, I pause, just for a moment, and I scan the floor. Not looking for anything specific, just checking. Checking for marks, for scuffs, for any sign that something has been dragged across the surface. I don't know why I do it. I don't even realize I'm doing it until after it's already happened. It's just a reflex now. A quiet, compulsive habit. I was in a coffee shop this morning waiting for a friend. I paused, as always, just inside the doorway. My eyes scanned the tile floor, moving from the entrance toward the counter. Then I ordered a coffee and tried to forget about it, but the habit remains, and I know, somehow, that it always will.